sad that a lot of people aren't here actually, because I think it's a very relevant topic. But hopefully people will watch the video. So as usual, I didn't have a assigned topic.
Sorry.
You know, with everything going on in the news lately, I thought that this would be a relevant discussion, is to just touch on morality and kind of relate that to sexuality. You know, it's a hot topic nowadays. It's in the public realm a lot more than it has been, I think, in recent years. And there's so much discussion going on in all of our circles, so you really can't escape it. People are talking about it at work, people are talking about it at school, and so I wanted us to discuss it because I think it's important for us as Orthodox Christians to be able to join that conversation in a truthful way and to not shy away from it. So, so on we go. So first I'll ask, what is a person? I'm not going to really open this up because this is more like read my mind type of question. But we can essentially say that there's a universal or ethical doctrine that all people are valuable. All humans are valuable. And that additionally, all are equally valuable. So one is not more valuable because they're stronger, because they're smarter, because they're more beautiful. That doesn't make a difference, but value is assigned to everyone. It may, however, come as a surprise that that wasn't always the case. In ancient Roman history, you were able to, you know, leave your family or kill your family even if you weren't satisfied. We've heard of children being killed if they weren't male, and they got rid of females. So there's been times when that equality or the value of people has not been the same throughout history. So how did, actually this sense of equality, this concept of equality came with the introduction of Christianity, and more so in the New Testament. With the new covenant, with Christ coming and declaring that all is equal, right? Christ came for our salvation, and he came for both the Jew and the non-Jew, for the Gentiles and the non-Gentiles. And we see this in St. Paul's writing several times, where neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male or female, none of those boundaries, none of those lines exist anymore, because everyone is the same in Christ. You're all one in Christ. And this is a big change from before. You know, there was slavery, and the slave was not considered equal. But in Christianity, a slave is equal to the master. So this advent of, you know, no longer is man higher than woman. No longer is one race better than the other. Everything is equal. And we're all in Christ. We all have the same equal value that every person has in the church and even outside the church. So why is this important? Well, mainly because of this cardinal event in history, is the incarnation. And a lot of us don't realize how crazy the incarnation is, because to think that God has come and born human nature, to take on human nature, is something that nobody in the world at that time would have fathomed. No Jew, no Greek, no pagan would have ever thought that God could come and be born into a human. And so Jesus, being the best person, the most noble person, the most beautiful, powerful, came and found himself in a human person. And it seems obvious to us, but again, this was something that would be completely absurd in the first century. What does this mean for value, though? Well, it really shook the earth at that time, because now you have the presence of divinity, the presence of divine life, being manifested not just in a man, but also manifested in a baby, manifested in a child, manifested in the womb of St. Mary, Virgin. And that means, that gives us something to think about in terms of the fact that human nature, or humanity itself, has much more value if God can come into the womb and take the form of man. So this concept of value starts from the very beginning of conception, we'll say, through eternity, and that value is given through Christianity and through the incarnation of Christ. Questions on this? Are you guys following? No? Okay. So this is why human nature then can convey the presence of God, because it's designed from the start according to the image of God. And this is, the classic picture or imagery that we are vessels for God. And that goes beyond, like I said, it goes beyond race. It goes beyond whether you're male or female, your social status, etc. And this is what it means to be human, is that we are distinct beings and we are made to live in communion with God. So as a human person, that's really the essence of it, is that we are all distinct and made to live in communion with God and communion with other people. And remembering that our life came from God from the start, and so our worth comes from God as well. Okay. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about this concept of moral relativism. Have you guys heard of this concept before?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just for my clarification, because I think I missed something. So is the previous part you're talking about the intrinsic value of human life, right?
Correct.
Is that because it comes or extends from the incarnation, or is that the incarnation just kind of a confirmation of that intrinsic?
Yeah, more of a confirmation.
Okay.
That because Christ stooped down, lowered himself to become human, that it raised really the value of human nature. Not that it wasn't there from the beginning, but that it was not realized.
Mm-hmm. I guess my question is that value through faith in Christ? In other words, we're part of one body, and that body becomes an extension of God. That value comes from that, or is it just the human value is intrinsically there, and now we've got that elevation as being part of the body?
It's not doesn't have anything to do with Christianity.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's just the fact that human nature in and of itself is valuable, is worth something, and we as a people, as mankind, didn't really understand that worth until the incarnation. And the incarnation of Christ has shown that human nature is actually like, wow, that's something a lot more important than once thought prior.
Gotcha.
And with that, Christ came, with the equality of all human nature, all humankind. It's not just the Jews anymore that are God's people. It's everyone is God's people.
Okay.
Is that
I
correct?
once heard the same thing that you're saying, like kind of an analogy that the value that we have is based on who created us. And the analogy was that when you look at a work of art and you say this is a Monet or this is a Da Vinci, it's not necessarily the piece itself is of value, but because it was created by this person, that's what gives it value more than anything else. And so because we are created by God, that's where our value comes from and who created us.
Any other questions? So have you guys heard of this concept of moral relativism? Anyone heard of it?
Sure.
Yeah? What do you know about it?
That it's just morality is based on you as a person and what you decide is moral. So if you're a Christian, you have certain values, but if you're a Buddhist, you can have your own values, but neither is right. That's their idea that neither of them is right. It's based on what you kind of thing.
Excellent, great. So I'll talk a little bit about moral relativism and why. I'll explain a little bit about it, but essentially that's exactly it. Is that morality is now relative, and it can be relative in different ways. It can be relative to a culture. It can be relative to an individual. It can be relative to a group of people. But it's essentially that morality is reduced to personal taste, personal opinion. One of the big features of moral relativism is this concept of tolerance, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But tolerance is essentially the ultimate virtue. Is that I have my beliefs, you have your beliefs, and I'm tolerant of your beliefs, and that I understand that, and that makes sense. That's I think that's happened last time.
Yeah, you just have to reconnect it. It does that randomly.
There you go.
And what this means essentially is that truth has become relative to the individual. So you have your set of truths, I have my set of truths, and I'm okay with your set, you're okay with my set, and that's basically how we live. So essentially only opinions exist. Everything's subjective. So the moral question of what is good has actually been changed in our society to what feels good. So morality is no longer objective. So, for example, questions like, is abortion good or bad, or is same-sex marriage good or bad, actually turns into, well, how does abortion make me feel? Is same-sex marriage feel good or bad to that individual, okay? So, instead of morality constraining pleasure, now pleasure defines morality. So you have this paradigm shift of, I have my standards and morals, and this is what I believe, and that being my own moral code, and that dictating my behavior. Instead, it's, well, my behavior is this, and it feels good, and this is what I want to do, and now I'm finding a means or a way to justify it, and that's unfortunately the shift that our society is taking these days. So the ethics have actually been converted from morality, from a moral code, to really just pleasure and self-seeking behavior.
When did this? Do you think the decay in the moral code, is that something that I felt like we've always had that? I mean, but it goes through phases. I mean, it was obvious in the '60s, and then it seemed like it came back in the '80s, where people, you know, they were much moral and virtue and the way they approached life, and I think now we're seeing that decay again. Do you see it as a cyclical, or do you see that this is more
It's I'll touch on that a little bit, but it's very cyclical. Actually,
It's very what?
the cycles, it kind of goes up and down. But everything that's happening now is not new in history.
No, it's not.
I was just
I
about to
mean,
ask
it's
you
very,
about
it's
Yeah.
there's writings about Sodom,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and all that. Yeah, all these things that are happening now happened in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
The interesting thing about that, though, is that they say they're tolerant, but as soon as you don't agree, they're no longer tolerant.
Right.
Like,
You have to agree with them.
Yes, you're only tolerant to an extent. So they're only tolerant if we both agree that same-sex marriage is okay. But then if you don't, then they're not tolerant. But they're still technically tolerant. You're the one who's hateful.
Right.
Like they're the one.
And this is
But this is
major-
becoming an extreme, though. I mean,
I actually don't. I think
You
that
don't-
this is actually becoming a norm. So tolerance is so advocated nowadays. But the truth is that relativists who advocate tolerance are actually intolerant of truth. So they want everyone to be tolerant, but when someone has an absolute truth and a true moral code, they're intolerant of that. Well, you know, you're
too strict.
you're not flexible.
Yeah.
You're not
Mhm.
open-minded.
Too religious.
You're
Yeah.
But the
exactly.
other interesting thing about that is it's mostly aimed at Christianity, because you see all this stuff, but then they're like, oh, Islam is good. Islam is good. Like they just want to put that in your head that like Islam is the tolerant one. They're the ones who, but like they don't really. It's aimed at Christians specifically. Like that's what I'm trying to say. It's like it's not really that much of any other religion. They're really just talking about Christianity.
yeah, the attack on Christianity has been
Yeah.
going on forever, but it's
Right.
just taken.
Right.
There's also.
Well, even people who consider themselves Christians do that.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's
I mean,
taboo.
tolerance is
Yeah.
a huge concept within Christianity that a lot of people advocate. And we'll touch on that in a little bit as well about
It's
what
taboo
true
to be
tolerance
Christian.
means.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so you guys following me with this? This is moral relativism. So this this concept is not. I mean, America at this stage is not completely morally relativistic. Okay, I think some aspects of our society are, but some of them are still not quite there, and I'll get to what that means in a second. So there's two types of relativism. There's cultural relativism and there's individual relativism. So what's the difference? So cultural relativism will vary by culture. Okay, usually, there's a different moral code in Egyptian culture than there is in American culture or Greek culture or culture in the UK, whatever it is. And it's just diversity. Right. It's just a diversity of values. For the most part, though, the differences in the values may not be very drastic, but it's really just a change in perception of facts. It's a change in perception of the facts. I'll give you an example. Most cultures will agree that killing innocent people is wrong. Okay? There's laws in almost every culture against that. Okay? So then I ask you, how did Hitler convince almost everyone in his country that killing innocent people was okay?
He demonized them.
Yeah, exactly. So he dehumanized Jews and any other culture that he was against, right? So he made them subhuman. So now we're not killing humans, we're killing subhumans. Okay, we're changing the facts. Okay, same is true of abortion, right? It's a difference in perception of the fact. When does the fetus become a baby? When does that have life? Okay, when does the unborn child have life? So it's a difference in perception of facts. Some people will say at conception, some people will say not till 6 months or whatever it is. And so that's how things are justified. Okay. And so these cultural relativism then just varies at different cultures have their different perceptions. And then individual relativism, like we discussed already, is that your moral code is defined by you personally, and your morality is private. It's an intimate thing. So each person acts as their own conscience dictates. And like I said, this is not new to society. If we look in the book of Judges, even in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So when there's no superseding authority, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So everyone had their own moral code. Okay. The support of moral relativism, so people who are moral relativists support or show their logic for this by a few ways. One is they think that there's such an information explosion in the world, there's so much information out there, that there can't be any absolute truths, that nothing can be black and white, because there's so much out there, so much we don't know. There's no, universal knowledge or universal facts are impossible, is what they say. They also claim that that objective universal knowledge actually leads to intolerance, right? So if you think that your way is right, well then now you're intolerant. And actually an absolute moral code showing that you are against individual human rights. So if I have my set of facts and morals, then I'm against individualism and having individual human rights. They also claim that relativists are humble because they can be tolerant of other people and accepting of other moral codes. And they also say that absolute morality, absolute truth, leads to pride, dogmatism, and bigotry. Pride, dogmatism, and bigotry. So this is all support for moral relativism. However, if you actually sit and think about it, there are a lot of flaws with this theory. Can you guys think of any?
You're only tolerant to people who agree with you. It's not like other.
Okay, good.
And if nothing is right, then who's to tell me to do anything? That completely degrades society.
Very good.
I have no if I think killing people is okay, then it's okay for me.
Very good. What are you going into? Dentistry?
Yeah.
You should go into philosophy or something.
I don't think she should get a degree in philosophy. I'm not sure what she would do with that.
I'm impressed. Good. So you touched on a few of the reasons. First flaw is that you have no external standard by which you define anything, right? So there are differences in opinion. No opinion is correct. So society then becomes defined by its actions and behaviors rather than the other way around. So you can't say that there's no standard by which you judge anything on. It's also basically impossible to practice any type of moral reformation or try to improve the social code. You can't say, well, Egyptian or American society is corrupt and it needs to be fixed. It can't be fixed if there's nothing to fix it with, right? There's no standard to set it by. And this fact that there's no external standard leads to the other flaws with it is, one, it's impossible to criticize the actions of others, okay? You can't accuse others of wrongdoing if they have a different moral code. So people who believe in this, ask them the question, are terrorists bad? You can't say, if you believe in moral relativism, that terrorists are bad, because they just abide by a different moral code. They think, like you mentioned, that killing is okay.
They can see it like they're fighting for a cause, not that they're being terrorists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is this what it's being taught now? I mean, is this... I saw a video, and I should share it with you at some point, and I saw this a couple of days ago, and it was really actually very dangerous. This was, I believe, out of California, Berkeley. It was a free speech, right? And the speaker was asking a question, just sharing, and somebody stood up, and obviously this was a student, but this is what they're thinking, is that we should not have governments. Because, so he's like, well, where are you going to have laws? Well, no laws, no government. So where does this all start? I think it's, whether they're thinking is socialism or whatever, it's not right for you to have 3 homes or 2 homes. If you have 3 homes, I have a right to take it. For the people to be out in the streets, they have a right to move in and take it. Take it by force, take it by whatever.
But this is the difference between practice and theory, right?
Theory, I don't know about theory. I mean, we're getting to the point where...
Right, no, but I mean, there's relativism, but I mean, you can't argue there's no defining legal, there's a legal system or order in because otherwise what
it's
you have is
anarchy,
right?
It's anarchy, and that's
Right.
what they're
And this-
saying.
and
That's what they're pushing, man,
Right.
friend.
But they're pushing for social anarchy, whether it involves the government or not.
ازيك يا جينيفر؟ ايه الباقيين النهارده اساسا؟
انت مش شايفهم يا
النضارة.
extra glasses.
Stay first, you're close.
What did you feed your daughter? She's a smart girl.
I'm not worthy.
عشان خاطر طيب.
I'm blessed to know.
No, we didn't talk about that. I'm a word.
ازيك يا جيني؟
She's like, I'm just not. Okay. That's not talking about the area. There was just one lady
I
around.
think you're colorblind.
اقعد فلوس and relativism يعني ايه relativism؟ يعني ايه
Relativism? So
relativism.
it's when people have different moral codes.
Your truth is not my
Relative
truth.
morality is relative to different people.
Oh, okay, so how to deal with them يعني؟
Yes, we're getting there.
يعني actually يعني what I believe احنا we accept everyone but we don't accept the idea of everyone.
Absolutely.
يعني I can accept this is your way and this is what you behave and this is what you get in, but at the same time I don't have to accept your idea.
For sure.
عشان كده I have to have my own personality and my own belief in according to the law of Jesus Christ and according to the Bible.
Exactly.
انت بتعمل ايه؟
I'm recording you.
ربنا يستر عليك. ربنا يحافظ عليك وأولادك.
Thank you.
وبعدين على نفس الكندا ربنا يستر على الكندا.
I know, not that bad.
ربنا معاك وأولادك.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so getting back to this. So it's impossible to criticize actions of others because people just have a different moral code. If you believe in relativism, you have to surrender the privilege of passing moral judgment on other people. You can't say that some things are right or wrong, or else relativism would be false. The other thing is you can't complain about the problem of evil, because even in this world, even evil becomes relative, right? You can't even argue or blame God about evil, because evil essentially at its core foundation marks the departure from a moral standard. So if you don't have that moral standard, then how do you define evil?
But the people who claim they follow this way of thinking or whatever, they don't even follow those three principles.
Right.
Like they just kind of, it's whatever they think is right, they have to impose it on other people. That's why it has to be legal to have an abortion, and you can't have like a contradiction to that, because then you're encroaching on someone else's relativism. You know what I'm saying? So like they have their own like way of thinking, but then that's the only way of thinking. Like they claim they're tolerant, but like they're really the most intolerant people.
Right.
But one of the concerns too is, the thing is when you go down that path, there's no boundaries to it. You know, the concept of law, like Heather was saying, well, a lot of the laws are based on the Judeo-Christian values of what's right and wrong. So if you become a society that doesn't accept those, then actually your laws are based on things that don't have a foundation. Like when you start removing the Ten Commandments from the courthouses, well, that's really what a lot of the law is based on, is this concept of right and wrong. And so when we take those away, then you can almost argue any law, well, why should we even have that law? Why shouldn't you steal from someone else? Why shouldn't you kill someone else? Why shouldn't you? I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about the concept of when I start saying there is no right and wrong and everything is relative, where does it stop? There's no stopping it, because there's no boundary. Even when I say, well, it's against the law, well, what's that law based on? It's based on people thought this was right and this was wrong. That's the scary thing, is that you can take it, there's no
and that's
end
where
to
we're
it.
getting.
That's
right?
where we're going.
This is exactly the path that we're taking as a society, is that, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but concepts now that are becoming legal were considered completely inappropriate and not even talked about in public 50 years ago.
Right.
And so we are getting to the point where there is no the boundary keeps getting pushed and pushed and pushed. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is that everything I'm talking about here actually so far has nothing to do with Christianity, right? These are all flaws based on logic. So you can use these, because a lot of people that may be fighting you against things like abortion and same-sex marriage will think that we only use Christian ideals to counteract that, but there's so much about natural law and natural logic that goes against what they believe. And I want us as a community really to tease that out more and be able to talk back to people and answer them without having to use Christian ideals, because a lot of what they advocate for is against nature itself.
And it's interesting that what's really scary in all this is our court systems, even all the way up to our Supreme Courts, they're starting to adapt a lot of these far left ideals when they should have actually been held to the Judeo-Christian principles, because that's how our court system were designed and implemented.
They're veering a lot further and further away from the original Bill of Rights that were written hundreds of years ago with Judeo-Christian principles, but now they're using, unfortunately, societal norms and standards to interpret the law that was written many years ago. So it's becoming a dangerous state.
There's also a part with the next generations always coming up, that they're conforming people through media, through movies, whatever. I mean, I have to be careful whenever we do the Friday night sleepovers and stuff. I have to watch the entire movie just to make sure there's nothing in there. And I was watching Beauty and the Beast, which I saw when I was a kid. It was a wonderful movie. I love the story and everything. But now you got this guy dancing with this guy, and he's wearing a girl's dress as a funny comedy part. I'm like, what are you guys saying?
You're talking about the new Beauty.
It's the new Beauty and the Beast.
The new Beauty and the Beast.
And
I'm like,
he's written as a homosexual.
he's written off as, and he's like, oh, I love this, and how can you leave me for Belle and all this stuff?
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are you doing? It just totally destroys the whole. I mean, if a child's watching this, he's like, that's normal.
Right.
You know, and so now it's relative to him that this is how the world is.
The left is loud. That's what people don't understand.
Emotional.
They're
Yeah.
loud. They're just loud. Like they're all over Twitter and they're on Facebook and they're and so like you just start to adapt to these principles because they're just in your ears all the time. That's all you hear. Like you look on Facebook, it's all this stuff. You look on Twitter, it's all this stuff.
And they
You
twist
watch
it.
Beauty
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
Beast with your children,
Yes.
and then it's all like they're just loud. Like they're just putting it everywhere. You're constantly seeing it. You're
Yes.
constantly hearing it, and so it just becomes something that's normal to you. So
And this-
that's how they do it.
Yeah, this is one of the dangers of our
And then almost,
society because we as Orthodox Christians, I'm sorry to say, but I think this is one of the flaws with our culture is that we don't seek for
To
truth
fight for the
and
truth.
rationalism. Okay, a lot of us you're raised in the church. These are what we believe in, but we don't know why we believe in these things. We don't understand the deeper meaning behind it. We don't understand things like natural law, natural logic, and everything's just based off of Christian ideals.
Do we
So-
not understand it, or we're not willing to fight?
Yeah, we have no
We don't wanna
ambition
get
to
into
learn
it,
about it.
yeah.
No, we don't understand it.
We have,
I mean,
I mean, a lot of people understand, but
no,
they're
they
scared.
understand it, but
It's
they're.
both.
You're
I'm too
scared.
busy with my life to get involved
Yeah.
in all this.
I know what I believe, and I'll
Yeah,
stick
and
with
that's
those
me.
beliefs.
But
But I don't
it
care
only
about
matters to
all
me
that.
and my family.
But I think
But-
Nathan's right. If I knew why, I would be more confident engaging others.
Right.
But I just believe it. This is how I grew up. This is
Right.
what they taught me. I believe it to be true, without understanding how to articulate why.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then I
Well,
just mind
well,
my own business. You believe what you believe.
And a lot of times that if you start to deal with somebody or an issue, then you're not a loving Christian, because if you're loving, then you're accepting and you understand who I am and all
Use
this.
your argument
Yeah.
against you.
And our church has built so much symbolism into everything that people don't want to look past the surface.
Mhm.
Like I had a long
Very true.
conversation with some of my cousins, and just teaching them, like just explaining to them just the simple ABCs of the liturgy, and they were absolutely blown away. They were like, "Wow, I never knew any of this." I'm like, "How can you not know this?"
I had an argument with someone about baptism,
Mhm.
and someone from our church a few years back, and I asked her, why does someone that's already been baptized in another church have to be baptized here again? And her answer, because she was firm on like arguing with me, like she's like, no, that's awful, yes they have to. And then I was like, so why? And she just looked at me and said, I don't know, ask Abuna. And I'm like, you can't be arguing with
You can't
me
argue in front of
with all
people
this
that understand.
passion without knowing why you're saying what you're saying.
The other part of it though is that they tend to attack you like as a human being. Like they don't tend to attack your argument as much as they do like at you. You know what I'm saying? Like they're like, well then you're not tolerant. Well then you blah blah blah.
You're
Like
not
they
loving.
attack you. They're not attacking your argument, and that's why a lot of people back down. Is like they feel like, oh, I'm being attacked, so I'm just gonna back down. It's not. They don't really address your argument
Being
because they
labeled
don't
you.
have any
Yeah.
real
Yeah.
answers to what you're saying. But they know if they can like attack you, you'll just back down. You'll stop
You're
talking.
racist.
Hello. Thank you.
The other irony is the concept of relativism is actually in Paul's teachings. In Corinthians, he talks about, and I know this has nothing to do with this, but just the concept is, to the Jew I became a Jew, and to the Greek I became like Greek, to the non-circumcised, to those who are not under circumcision, I made myself as if I was not under the law, to those not under the law, etc., etc. So that idea of adapting yourself to the people around you just so that you can bring forth the message, that's actually an apostolic concept.
Yes.
I don't-
Which,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
but
don't
at the same
understand.
time, it's kind
No,
of.
I know it has nothing to do with
No, but it's actually like what
not-
Jennifer said, because those boundaries are not actually boundaries, because we're all equal in value. So those are Jew and Greek and slave and free they don't, in those times that meant different values of people, but in actuality they're not. But what he's saying is that this message is for everyone,
Right.
and these things don't mean you can or can't receive it, or I can speak to you about it or
Right.
shouldn't.
Yeah.
Which was different than the Old Testament, where the Jews also kept. They weren't necessarily trying to go out and preach the world, because they were God's chosen people, and that's
Right.
that they didn't intermingle. So that concept, but at the same time, it follows the idea that it's not actually relative, because Jew and Greek and those kind of things are relative. Like they're boundaries created and classifications created by man. They're not God's classifications,
Right.
right? So he was wanting to teach them the truth and that everybody receive it, and he was teaching it on a humanity level more so than the human class.
No, I know. I'm just talking about
Yeah,
the
but
concept as
right.
just as a concept.
Yeah.
I got it.
Take care.
Okay, and then the last flaw with relativism is that the blame and praising really is there's nothing to blame and there's nothing to praise, right? Those become meaningless. There's no standard for which things are considered either ultimately good or ultimately bad. So you can't assign blame to people. You can't. The concept of fairness as well. You can't say, oh, that's unfair. What are you basing your fairness on, right? So any people who believe in that, you can counteract with these arguments that if you believe in this, you basically live in the gray area, then there can't be any black and white with anything that you believe in. Okay, is killing wrong? The answer to that has to be no, because everything else is relative. So, like I mentioned, we're not totally there yet, but I think that we are getting there as a society. And I'll touch a little bit on tolerance since we were talking about that. So like I mentioned, this is strongly advocated by people who believe in relativism and basically our modern society. But what is tolerance? How do we define tolerance as Christians?
Accepting.
Acceptance of people, but not necessarily like what they believe. Like we're not gonna.
I feel like you should come to this lesson.
She's like, I can't even talk.
Here you go. Take over.
That's exactly right. Is that tolerance for Christians means that we are tolerant of people, but not their beliefs or their behaviors. So what does that mean? You apply it to people. So if you have a different opinion than me, then I will hear your opinion, I will understand your opinion, I will show empathy and love as I'm doing that, but I don't have to agree with what you say. And I can love you as a person, but I don't have to agree with what you believe in or what your behaviors are.
Is it your duty to actually attempt to change their moral compass? I mean, you can be accepting. I mean, can you challenge it? You should be challenging it.
You should, as a Christian,
Yes.
within reason, I would say. So you can always gauge how accepting someone will be of having a conversation. So if you're talking to someone about abortion or same-sex marriage, you can gauge in just your conversation with them and their explanation of it, of how engaged they can be with you and have a civil conversation about it. But I think it's always important to make your truths known, right? That we have to make sure that other people realize that there is a moral code that we live and that we believe in, and that there is a basis for it. Not only a Christian basis, but also a biological basis and a psychological basis for it. But like I said, you have to be educated in that to have those conversations. And I think a lot of us are not educated enough, excuse me, and I'm including myself, are not educated enough to be confident to have those conversations with people. And so we shy away from it. Because I may not have the answer for, well, why is abortion wrong? Like, what's so wrong with it? Why is same-sex marriage wrong? They don't affect you. Why is that wrong? But you have to realize all the underlying mechanisms and all the underlying pathological issues that make same-sex marriage wrong.
You just know some, simple talking points, but as far as the depth and knowledge of, and the roots of why it's wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can prove that same-sex marriage is wrong without bringing up Christian ideals at all. And I don't think a lot of us know how to do that.
Okay. So, at what point? I mean, it's good to say what you believe, and that's good, and to make it known. But at some point, your actions is really what defines what you really believe.
Sure.
So I could say smoking is bad. It's not Christian-like. God, this should be your whole temple, and so forth and so on. But then, if I'm spending my time with and hanging around and saying, well, I accept all these people when we smoke together or whatever, any level of smoking, then what was my message?
You basically negate anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and that's the challenge right there. And that's the true display of what your morality is.
Right.
Is living that actual life. So some people believe in same-sex marriage or you know, whatever the millions of beliefs out there. As long as you live your life according to your Christian moral code, then at least they have an example of that. That they can see that your moral code is being lived out.
Mm-hmm.
So being examples of good Christians
Right.
in the world, so they can see that. Maybe someone believes in divorce. Give you an easy example is divorce. A lot of people think divorce is no big deal. Well, a lot of those people might have never been exposed to a good, healthy marriage and understand that the concepts of parenthood. And so, if they can see that example in you, a healthy marriage with you and your husband, or you and your wife and your children, then that allows them to see that there is a true sanctity of marriage that they may not have understood. And so so understanding those concepts and you're just displaying it, that's your unspoken ministry to them.
But she's right though, like you don't have to bring up Christian ideals at all. Like look at the kids who come from divorced families. Like they have all these issues, then they get married and then they have a higher rate of divorce. And then, you know, like they continue
But
down
that's not necessarily true in every single marriage. Like, it's not necessarily true. But you know what they'll argue though is that you've seen healthy marriages, but you haven't seen a man who beats a woman and she has to get a divorce because she's in a really unhealthy,
Right.
you know, relationship. So
Christianity
But
is not
there's
against that.
there's
Yeah.
exceptions.
there's a couple of exceptions, but then where do you stop? Because they'll say, well, he's, you know, emotionally abusing me. How do you, you know, you can't tell this
Christianity
person's.
is also not against that.
Yeah, there's.
I don't know about the divorce.
You're mixing our culture with
Right.
with what.
The Bible says you can get
Christianity
divorced in certain circumstances.
There even St. Paul says let them separate, but the concept of them then getting remarried and stuff, you know,
Yeah.
to be, you know,
That's
but
an issue.
but I would agree that though our church has a belief about divorce and you know the sanctity of marriage, I think there is some now separation between culture and then there is some additional intellect being applied to, you know, this situation. You know, is it good for them? You just want them to look like they're married on the outside. We don't really care what they're doing to each other inside. Like that concept is now changing, and the church is putting more, I guess, laws and ideas in place for when it is appropriate. And like, you know, she said, yes, you can't generalize and say all children of divorced or all whatever, but there are definitely statistics and tendencies that people who came from broken homes are so much more likely to get divorced, you know, and that's going to be anything, because you can apply that to divorce, you can apply that to alcoholism, you can apply that to multiple things that you learn from your home that you carry on those behaviors.
Right.
Good. So we understand what tolerance is in the Christian aspect. You also have to realize that relativism essentially destroys people's conscience. And when you have no barometer of right and wrong, then relativists actually become very self-centered. It's all about self-seeking pleasure. What makes me happy? What feels good? And that's why you have to be careful, because there is a connection between relativism and atheism. Okay, if you have no barometer of right and wrong, you have no standard ethical moral code, then you are essentially living yourself as your own God, right? And we see that with the quote in Judges: there was no king in Israel, everyone did what they wanted, right? So there was no overriding authority, so everyone does what they think is correct. And in Christian terms, this is the same as us quenching the Holy Spirit, right? If you have become so cold in your spiritual life and you quench the Holy Spirit, that flame inside of us, you lose your conscience. And so the barriers, the boundaries between right and wrong become very blurred. So getting back to the concept of morality, where do our morals come from?
God-given laws
When?
from the time of Moses.
No, time of Adam.
How?
How? At the time of Adam, he's set a rule, live in this way. They disobeyed that rule, and then there was consequences from that. So the degradation started from Adam saying that, okay, if you follow my way, you will have life. Since you don't follow my way, then you start going down this dark path. And it kept degrading and degrading, even to the point of Moses where they had to set written laws, you know, to say, okay, now if you even don't follow this, which is just the basics.
But do you think that a person who's never read the Ten Commandments or never has been exposed to
That's what I'm saying.
Christianity?
It's at the time of creation, God created
Okay.
in us. You
So
have a sense, even if you don't know God Himself, you have a sense.
Good.
Killing is wrong.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
So it's not that it was God telling Adam these things, it's the fact that we are all naturally ingrained with morals, this unwritten code. Remember that, it's unwritten. So this is separate from the Ten Commandments, this is separate from any of the Christian values, but it's this unwritten code. So if someone goes out and kills somebody, that person will feel guilt. Okay, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe in, there will be a sense of guilt in you. Okay, so we all have this unwritten morality that tells us what's right and what's wrong. So morals are not material principles, but kind of an unspoken truth. And obviously the moral code comes from a moral lawgiver. This is what we believe. I don't want to get too much into this, but does anyone know who this is? C.S. Lewis?
I was like, he looks familiar. I read a lot of his books.
So in Mere Christianity, he writes a lot about morality, and he explains morality. He explains the three concepts that morality is ingrained in human nature, that morality comes from a moral lawgiver that is above the universe, and if that's true, then there has to be something that's greater than the universe that dictates this morality, and therefore there's an existence of God. So those are kind of his four basic facets of this, and he explains through no Christian examples or anything at all how morality became into existence. And so if you have time, I had reread part of the book yesterday, but he speaks extensively about this, and most Christian scholars now, when they talk about morality, will reference C.S. Lewis in these earlier discussions. So we also there are biblical examples of morality being ingrained in us. So from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, he says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen." Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his external power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, etc. So clearly, he says that since creation, you can see God around us. You can see that he is visible in all creation, and that they knew God. So the concept of God and understanding that God is the higher power was there since the beginning of time. And then also in Romans, he says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing themselves." So what does that mean? That means that even Gentiles, who are not the chosen people at the time, have a law written in their hearts. So this is the oxymoron, the moral atheist. Okay, you just realize a moral atheist cannot exist, right? Because if you are a moral atheist, this is like the concept of there's a lot of good people who are not Christian. Why are they moral people? Why are they good people?
Yeah, I get that argument all the time. They're like, well, they do good.
But it's not, it doesn't make sense for them to be moral, right? If you don't believe in doing good, doesn't make it, in the difference between right or wrong, then it doesn't make sense for them. So, but basically he's saying that even the Gentiles had this law written in their hearts. So this moral code is something that's ingrained in us. So, getting back to what the title of the talk was, what does all this have to do with sexuality? Regarding sexuality, what do we believe as Christians?
It's a very big question.
Between man and woman in
It's not.
marriage.
There's actually one simple answer. You can sum up sexuality in one sentence for Orthodox Christians.
Purity. To be pure. To be holy and to keep
That's
yourself
purity.
pure.
Okay, so what's sexuality then? When should sexuality be used?
Marriage.
Yeah. So, in essence, for Orthodox Christians, the proper social context of sexuality or sexual relationships is in marriage with a man and a woman who are in communion with each other for life.
Mhm.
Okay, that's the gist of sexuality for Orthodox Christians. Why is that? Marriage is the only place where you can have self-sacrificial love or self-emptying love necessary for that communion, and it's the only place where you can create life. Okay, so there's a lot of back history of this and understanding like why this is the sanctity of marriage in our church. The abridged version is that Christ came, died for our sins. He is the bridegroom. The church is the bride. They're in communion with each other, and we manifest that love or that church, that Godhead in marriage, man, woman, marriage, sexuality. Okay, that those all go into one. So there's really, aside from that, there's no other definition of sexuality in the Orthodox Church. So it's just the sacrament in itself. Why is this so? Well, it's God's design and His purpose for us. Any sexual activity outside of that bond is spiritually and physically destructive and not according to God's design. I'd say because it's not according to God's design. And it doesn't matter whether it's heterosexual or homosexual or all the millions of things that are happening these days, but anything outside of God's design is a problem. Doesn't matter if it feels right, doesn't matter if it feels like it was meant to be, or some people can't help it. None of that really matters. It's about what God's design and purpose is. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people will say, like, you know, this makes me happy or this makes me fulfilled. And they think that if it's what they want, it must be what God wants too. But we have to realize that our desires currently are shaped by the presence of sin and corruption that happened a long time ago with the fall of man. And so we can't claim that the way we feel is that the way God made us. Okay, and that's a big distinction between Christianity and non-Christians. Is that we can't claim the way that we feel is right, because our feelings are wrong most of the time. And God doesn't desire for us to be using our bodies outside of that design. Biologically, it doesn't make sense. And obviously, certain body parts were made for certain functions. Can you use them in the wrong way? Absolutely. Can it harm that function? Yes. But anything else that we use those parts for is not what the original design was for. So I'll give you an example. If I have a microphone, what's a microphone used for? To speak and project voice, right? If I have a piece of gum, can I put that piece of gum on the microphone? Exactly. So that's not its function. I can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that, I guess. It doesn't make sense, but there's no...
It doesn't serve its purpose.
Exactly. There's not a purpose in doing that. And that's just... It's a very silly example, but that's essentially, when it comes to sexuality, when we talk about God's design, is that, yeah, we have our own sexuality, we have our own body parts. They can be used for a lot of different things, but that's not the way God intended it to be. And so, remembering that our Orthodox Christian life is not about fulfilling our personal desires. It's about fulfilling God's desires. And we often think that we cannot be fulfilled or authentic human beings without doing what our feelings tell us to do. A lot of us, I'm including myself, want to do whatever our feelings say, but oftentimes our feelings are wrong. So it's important to understand here that when God teaches us that He wants us to be moral, it's not because He doesn't want us to be unhappy, but because this is how He designed us and how He wants us to live as authentic humans. He knows how humanity works because He created it that way. Any questions about this? Okay. But then we come to our society. And our society, unfortunately, is obsessed with sex. Society actually tells us that these lustful desires are natural, that they're healthy, that they're reasonable. So much so that resisting them is actually abnormal. And we see it everywhere. You can't turn on the TV or listen to music without some sexual innuendo in anything. Anything. I mean, you talked about Beauty and the Beast earlier, which is a child's movie, you know? Anything these days has something to do with it. And they associate the idea of sexual indulgence with normalcy, with being healthy, with being young and happy. And so this is surrounding us all the time. But I pose this question, are we defined by sex? Does sexuality define us? And this is what our society wants us to believe. Our society wants to believe that man is defined by his sexual desires, rather than his aspirations to regulate those desires, to channel those desires into actual morality or moral structures. So one of the talks I was listening to prepare for this, the author just makes the claim that you are not sex. Like sex does not define who you are as a person, and you don't need to be engaging in any type of sexual activity to be human, to be authentic. That's not part of our human nature. And the example he uses is that there are many saints who never had sex, and they are a perfect example for us. The most perfect human being who walked this world never had sex. And everything in our society in modern age is telling us that this is necessary. In and outside of marriage, doing whatever you please, and it's sad, really. So getting back to the theory of moral relativity, this is what I mean by some of our sexuality specifically is under this realm of moral relativism, because everything has changed from what makes me feel good and what I want to do, and that's really being justified nowadays. So the verse in Judges, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. Any type of sexual activity that is not based on self-giving, self-emptying, committed, and creative love is impure and it inevitably becomes self-centered. I'm going to say that again. Any type of sexual activity that is not based on self-giving, self-emptying, committed, and creative love is impure and will inevitably become self-centered, and often manipulative and degrading. And we can see this in a lot of what's going on in the world today. Love always has at its center the good and the welfare of the other. And in sexual activity outside of marriage, that's never really what's expected. The other person is not even thought of. It's about what's pleasing me and what makes me feel good. Questions or comments?
I like actually that moral, the relativism there, because even when we talk about something like homosexuality, you have very loud vocal people who are against homosexuality, but they're okay with heterosexual immorality because they don't divide it as immorality, which is sex outside of marriage. But they see we've defined that as sinful, but not the other side. If it's heterosexual, but they're not committed and they're not married and they're living together or they're whatever, that somehow didn't make it to their immoral list, even though it's still outside God's definition. And so that we can still create some relativism in there by defining somebody else's actions as immoral but not mine.
Right. Yeah, and that's why there's a very clear line of what is understood and what is accepted as sexuality in the Orthodox Church. It's within marriage between a man and a woman for life. Right? I mean, that's the basis of sexuality, and everything else falls outside of that line. A lot of people try to tiptoe along that line, especially during engagement period, which is a huge issue, right? Is that you're like, oh, well, we're gonna get married, it's gonna happen, and so we can cross that line here and there, but that's still, by the Orthodox Christian perspective, considered immoral.
I was just going to say, even some people can claim that pornography, or however they please themselves, is that I'm not hurting anyone else. This is my life. I can live the way I want to live. I'm not affecting anybody else.
Right.
But it's still relative to how you look at it. It's like, yeah, it's your life, but actually, you're still influencing society by engaging or supporting something that's morally wrong.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about pornography in a little bit,
Oh,
actually.
okay. Sorry, I stole your thunder.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
I'm sorry.
Good. Any other comments? I don't want to dwell too much on this. I think we all know what the standards of our faith are. But sometimes, I'm not teaching anything new. It's just a reminder, really, of what our moral code is, because everything in society is leaps and bounds beyond that at this point.
I do want to say that I think there's a struggle sometimes, even, we're allowed to date or we're not allowed to date, and what is defined dating and so forth, because of the culture in America, that if you're not dating, then there's something wrong with you, or so forth like this. I don't know if you want to touch on that, because that's part of the idea, is that if you're not going with what everybody else is doing, then there's something
Something wrong.
you're
not normal.
you're not thinking right.
you're
There's
not
something
normal.
weird about
Because
it.
that's the norm. Yeah.
Right, and so if we're not saying, go the extreme and have sex before marriage, but what's wrong with a kiss? It's just a kiss, and so forth. That they're trying to redefine the boundaries at some point, and some people push the limits further and further, and so forth. Yeah.
Right.
It's a song. A kiss is just a kiss.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that, at any point, any of that needs to be discussed with your spiritual father,
Right.
Your father, confession, whoever it is that you seek guidance from. I don't think dating's wrong, as long as you are dating for the
Your definition of dating is
goal.
different than other
Right.
people, and that's what
Yeah, and my definition is that you are dating for the goal
Of
to
marriage.
meet someone who you will marry
Right.
and be in a relationship with. And any dating outside of that is unnecessary. Mostly because you will fall into these problems and you will be faced with all these issues. And a lot of people will argue that you need to have more experience to be able to know what you want, and that's a very poor argument, because they have shown that people who cohabit before marriage actually statistically result in more divorce and more problems within marriage. So, that concept has no basis. But yeah, that's the point of raising your kids in a certain way, is so that they know where the lines are, what the boundaries are, and that they have an understanding of it that's beyond, well, that's just how we do it, or just because I said so.
Yeah, it's really important to teach your kids, and explain to them why those things matter.
Right. So this next quote I came across yesterday, which I really liked. Does anyone know who Joseph Ratzinger is? I'll tell you who he is after. But he's talking about St. Paul's epistle to the Romans here, and I found this to be very applicable.
Isn't he Pope Benedict?
Yeah, good. Pope Benedict 16?
Yeah.
Last one. So he says, the apostle declares that in reality this society knows God very well. So they are without excuse. And he's making reference to Romans 1:20, which I mentioned earlier. According to the apostle, the truth is accessible to them, but they do not want it because they refuse the demands that the truth would make on them. And this is people who live morally relative lives deny absolute truth because it goes against the life that they're living. Okay? When man prefers his own egoism, his pride, and his convenience to the demands made on him by the truth, the only possible outcome is an upside-down existence. Adoration is due to God alone, but what is adored is no longer God. Images, outward appearances, and current opinion have dominion over man. Current opinion have dominion over man. The general alteration extends to every sphere of life. That which is against nature becomes the norm. The man who lives against the truth also lives against nature. Okay? Think about all this in the context of today's society. His creativity is no longer at the service of the good. He devotes his genius to ever more refined forms of evil. This is usually, so no longer are you thinking of the other, everything has become self-centered and about your own person. The bonds between man and woman and between parents and children are dissolved so that the very sources from which life springs are blocked up. It is no longer life that reigns, but death. A civilization of death is formed. This is exactly what's happening in our culture today, right? Everything's going against nature. Same-sex marriage, transgenderism. You are blocking up the very source of life. I mean, procreation in itself is being stopped at the line, and people are saying that this is normal. That this is what's normal. And this is what we were getting at earlier, is that we keep pushing the boundary of what's considered nature and what's considered normal. It's as if you were to tell somebody 50 years ago that we are going to start arguing that 2 + 2 = 5. Like, you are changing the facts completely. And arguing that the grass is green and the sky is blue. Those arguments that are facts have gone so far away from that we are arguing those facts and instilling law, so far as instilling law to say that these things are normal.
You know, this is, I always liked Pope Benedict. It almost goes to contrary to what the present Pope of the Vatican believes.
What do you mean?
It's much more liberal.
Much more liberal. A lot of the things that are here, read this, and think about it, and then read more of what's his name? He's Pope what?
Pope Francis.
The Francis.
It's
Well, I mean, he comes from a social background, but that has nothing to do with it. His liberal views about transgender and LGBT and all this kind of stuff.
He's accepting them.
Much more so than
Accepting of it, or he's just loving towards them?
I don't know.
I don't know. I haven't followed really what he says.
Yeah, I question a lot of his teachings.
Yeah, he's more inclusive and those kind of things.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the things we touched on this, and I know I don't want to like go into something that you're going to go into, is like two things. One thing, when you're talking about natural law, this concept of relativism, because it goes against nature, like you're saying, if we don't have Christian arguments, nature in and of itself has laws. You know, gravity is always 0.988 blah blah, always. Like, it doesn't change. And I can't decide I want it to be something else, and you can have a value for gravity, and nature itself has very set rules. They're physics, science, chemical reactions, they're always going to proceed a certain way. And that's how nature is. There has to be rules. It's not relative. And you can't create a part of it that's relative when the structure of the universe is very finite and not relative, and it's set. So that's one aspect that it doesn't change. We can't create our own like laws, because nature and creation have set laws. But the other part is, I don't know if you're going to touch on that. Man, because we are created in God's image and we have the conscious within us, man has to feel he's moral. Okay? So he has to redefine morality to where he feels moral. So if I'm not aligned with the sexual definition between one man and one woman and within God's, and that's going to make me feel immoral, I'm going to reject that, because I don't fit in that. I have to feel moral. So I'm going to create that I recycle, therefore I'm moral. I don't cut down trees, therefore I'm moral. I eat healthy and exercise, therefore I am intellectual and a deep thinker and I'm moral. So I have to create some sort of laws for myself that make me moral. And that's where that, not just there's wrong, but there is a need for human beings to feel, all of them, even people who do things that are wrong, they have to justify what they did. And they create boundaries. Like, when you look at like gangs or whatever, you'll find that they have their own culture. Like, you don't do this to your gang brother. Why? Because like you create some laws to where you are within that, so you're a good person. Because we all need to feel that way about ourselves. It's just the way that God created us. So that's why we have to create new ones. If I can't fit into the Judeo-Christian or whatever we want to say, the culture, I have to create my own to where I become moral, and then I can live with myself.
Right. And this is, I had mentioned earlier that morality has become defined by how I feel now, right? Morality is, instead of morality constraining pleasure, pleasure is defining morality. So if I don't fit into, I don't feel like a girl and I want to be a boy, then I need society to tell me that that's okay. And that's where a lot of this stuff comes from.
Sorry.
The other thing I want to touch on, because this is what's happening right now, is the public discussion of sexuality. Some people will say that this is maybe good. There's some positive aspects to it. It can be liberating for some in some sorts. And, when women come forward and say that this person sexually harassed me, then maybe other women will come forward and not feel as afraid to do so. So that can be positive. Within the Christian realm, if you are publicly discussing some of your own struggles, then maybe that allows light to come in, right? When you expose the darkness, then light shines in. So that can be some of the positive aspects. But what I want to focus on really is the negative of it. And the reason is because this public discussion is pretty much a double-edged sword. I mentioned the positive. The negative is that as we lay out and discuss more of these in the public realm, or the public square, we inspire the thoughts and feelings of other people. So those rudimentary longings that were in the hearts of some people are now out in the open, and can spur the thoughts and desires of others. So I wanted to use the example of pornography because it's a ever-growing world, really. And there's strong evidence of this in pornography. So, on the one hand, pornography reflects the desires and fetishes of a few people, okay, a few users. But on the other hand, it also forms those desires and fetishes of others. Okay, does that make sense? So, someone has certain desire or certain fantasy, right? And it's exposed, and now it becomes the desire and fantasy of other people. So visitors to porn sites will be confronted with these suggestions of desires that they've never thought of before. And then the people who are more habitual, so this is like a new person, but people who are more habitual will need the intensification of those desires. So this is common in addiction, right? Any addict needs more and more to get to the high or to get to the pleasure that they're seeking. And unfortunately, this intensification strays into more specific, more peculiar, more abusive or violent types of fantasy worlds within the porn sites. And as they build, porn sites are not just people posting pictures. This is a full business, and they do marketing and a lot of analysis. And so as they build on data of the patterns, they continue to get even more clever with suggesting the new desire, the new fantasy for other people, which leads to this concept that the revelation of one man's desire becomes a temptation for many. So the revelation of one man's desire becomes a temptation for many. And the same pattern is visible in just general sexual relationships. And again, without being specific, it's undeniably true that sexual practices have changed dramatically over time. So that sexual practices now are much different than they were decades ago. And practices that were previously rare are much more commonplace and even accepted to some degree, right? And I'll go back to what we discussed before is this tangential or not? It's not, because a lot of these desires or a lot of these practices happened before Christ, in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, in the time of the ancient Romans and Greeks. Almost all the 4th century writers talk about the issue of sexual relations between a man and a boy. This is not a new concept to history. This has happened for thousands of years. And so why is it more prevalent today? Why does it seem more prevalent? And I think it's exactly because of this. Because you have the TV talking about it, you have it on the internet, you have people talking about it at work. Sex has just become more open to discussion. And the more that you talk about it, the more that people bring up these issues, and the more that it's revealed, then you have this problem, is that, oh, now I see this thing, and now I understand this thing, and now maybe I want to try it.
Experimenting.
And maybe it's now that's my new desire. So the more that it comes into the public square and public realm, the more temptation arises in thousands, if not millions, of other people. So it's this, I think this is the problem with our age now, is because of that, that's why it seems like we have such a big problem with sexuality and morality in our society.
But I think it's also overrepresented more than it actually is. Like, even when they do statistics and they say, for example, what percentage of the population identifies as homosexual, and people will often say like 10%, when in actuality it's like 2%. But because every show has like one token homosexual person or couple, it gives you the impression that it's actually more people than they are that identify themselves that way. Like, it's just overrepresented to make you think that it is actually still more than it is.
Right. I did look up statistics for homosexuality, and in Texas it's about 5% of the population that define as homosexual couples. I can't remember if it's couples or just homosexual in general. But that's definitely so, and I think it goes back to the concept that you brought up, is that a lot of these proponents of things like same-sex marriage and abortion are very loud and political. And so if for whatever reason you are perceived as not being a proponent of that, then you get kind of degraded. So a lot of TV networks actually have shows that are completely about homosexuality, right? And there's a TV show that I really liked that got pulled, and a lot of people think that it got pulled because it was actually about a normal family with Christian Republican ideals. And so it's unfortunate that that's the case, but it's really the fact that
I think I know that show. That's pretty good.
Last Man Standing.
Last Man Standing.
Yeah. That because the side that's more an advocate of this is so louder and more political, that it gets to seem like it's a lot more prevalent. So I think that's absolutely right.
Again, it's succumbing to the views of the minority, major minority. I mean, you're talking 5-10%. We're willing to give up our own code to please and to get those 2 to 5% vote.
Right, because we don't want to feel intolerant.
Yeah.
Right. So realize that we are completely changing the sanctity of marriage for 5 to maybe 10% of the population in the country.
You also begin to think that you're outnumbered as well. Like the 90% think like they are the 10%, and vice versa. And so you feel like you are one voice out of 100. That because they are loud and
obnoxious.
You feel like the minority when you have a different belief.
Right.
It's not.
Most of the media CNN, NBC, whatever. They control all of that. So like that's what.
Well,
people
you
hear
know
all
what? I
the time.
disagree with you because they make you think that they're in control, but the simple thing for us to do is to tune it out.
Exactly. But that's
We're in
what
control.
people hear, and that's what people listen to, and that's why you
But
think
you don't
that
have to,
you.
is what he's saying.
Yes, but that's why people think in general that they're outnumbered because they see it on all these big headlines and all these big whatever.
I agree, but we have a. It goes back to what we were saying earlier. You have to be able to stand up for what you believe in, right? Well, I absolutely love NFL. Okay, I love football, but you know what? This year, I don't. I don't because you know for whatever they're standing for. I mean, it's not just about standing. Actually, they're kneeling. It's more than that. I mean, we cannot continue to bow down because that's their view, and they think they control us. Absolutely not. Today they have the biggest boycott in the United States against them. I mean, you have people finally are standing up to them, and you know they have a 20% deterioration. So we are in control, regardless of those numbers. I mean, we're 90%. We should act like we're 90%.
And that kind of brings me to the conclusion of this is, what do we take away from this? Well, one is we live in this world, but we're not of this world. And that's something that we've all faced in our day-to-day life. I worry about the Christians, even within our own church, that don't really understand these ideals and that are tolerant of things like abortion and same-sex marriage and transgender rights and all those things, and don't really have the educational basis to say that they're against them. Because you'd be surprised if I were to bring a group of college and young professionals within the Coptic Orthodox Church, and I asked them for a non-Christian explanation of why abortion or same-sex marriage is wrong, there'd be very few who can answer. And that's a big issue, and that's why I encourage us to go out there and read, understand our beliefs, and understand our truths. And I capitalize T, truth, there, because our truth comes from Christ, and our truth comes from the Word of God. But there are our beliefs and our understanding of a lot of these moral issues even go beyond that, like I mentioned several times. A really good website, if you guys want to read about a lot of these controversial topics, is called The Public Discourse. It's a Catholic website, but they talk about all these issues: same-sex marriage, homosexuality, in vitro fertilization, all these like very controversial issues that unfortunately the Coptic Church is not as how should I say? Doesn't have as many answers for, I think, or doesn't publicize as many answers for. But if you go to that website, they have a lot of scholars, and these are people who are like in their bioethics centers kind of across the country, writing about all these topics and giving explanations beyond just what we believe as Christians. So do your due diligence as an Orthodox Christian and read up and understand what we believe and why we believe that.
It's a website or on YouTube?
It's a website. The other thing is to actually demonstrate true tolerance. So like I mentioned, true tolerance is having empathy and love towards other people and hearing them out, right? A lot of us don't hear each other out on both sides, on left and right? You just want to give your opinion, but you don't want to listen. So demonstrating that truly. And the last thing is being willing to share the truth, both about humanity, about human nature, and about your moral code and your morality and what you believe. So, whether that's sharing verbally or non-verbally, whether you're just demonstrating how you live a good Christian life and how you have a happy marriage, or how you disagree with abortion, or whatever it is maybe in your job even. I'm an anesthesiologist, but I won't do anesthesia for cases for abortion. So however it is that you demonstrate your moral code, then that's the life that you live. So
Sorry, what's the website again?
the public discourse. I think I did not put it on here. No, I did not. These are just some of the references I used. For those who don't know, Ancient Faith Radio is also another great source. Millions of sermons and lectures and podcasts and blogs. And it's all Orthodox. Ancient Faith Radio is all Orthodox. And then Father George Morelli writes an excellent article about homosexuality. It's also widely used. He's Antiochian Orthodox, based out of California, and he talks about the Orthodox Christian perspective of homosexuality. He uses both biblical and non-biblical explanations for that. You guys are a great group. Thanks for that.
So this was great. Thank you.
This is awesome.
I'm glad you picked. Because I wouldn't have thought of that. Every time I mention something, like they're like, no. Okay.
It took me like a week to actually think of it, and you know, with everything going on in the news, I was just like,
Sick of it.
yeah, I'm kind of tired of this. But it was a good reminder for me as well, because, and to, you know, by no means am I saying that I don't struggle with any of this sin. You know, everyone struggles with sexual sins and pleasures and desires and everything. And that's why we have to, you know, as we're dealing with other people who have different moral codes, is realize that we are not perfect. We have our own struggles. One of my favorite quotes, which I'm going to paraphrase, is that just because someone's sin is evident, that you can see it, it doesn't keep you safe from that sin. So if you see someone, you know, who's homosexual, you know that they're homosexual, and you see them committing that sin, you are not safe from that sin, and you should be more concerned, because that means that your sins are more internal and that you're more prideful and you can't see your own sins. So never focus on that person's behavior and the sinful act, but always remember to be introspective and looking at your own sins and your own faults while praying for yourself and for them.
I think part of also a challenge that I see even in our youth is that we don't know how to evangelize. We don't know how to share the truth, you know, whether, and it's kind of contradictory. We live on social media in a certain way, and people see parts of our life and the way we want to live, and we're part of society and we want to be accepted and so forth. And then we come to church and say, well, I believe this and this, but we don't bring that out to the world. So it's...
I think a lot of it's because we don't know what to say.
Exactly, but I like that you have references, and that we should share that more often than what we do share on social media, whether what I'm doing today, or I went here, or I ate here, and so forth, is not beneficial. That's just something that I've always tried to at least, you know, if I could find something that benefits me, then I try to share that. You know, it helps me to understand God better, it helps my relationship with God, or it helps me to express my love for God, you know. But I feel like we've gotten so accustomed to like social media, I just want everybody to know what I'm doing, whether it's good or bad, but it's not being a witness, like you said. It's not witnessing to the truth, it's just witnessing to my daily life.
But you know, right, like, it's the, you know, putting things sometimes on social media, like, without it having the personal relationship, can be sometimes not well received by others. Like, it looks like you're...
How do you mean?
Like, if I'm posting, you know, biblical quotes or facts or things like that, it's kind of different than when I'm, like, having a conversation with someone, and they feel like there is a non-judgmental, loving, like, way to say it, rather than, like, a truth in your face. Like, it just kind of just depends on who are your friends and who, you know, those kind of things. The reason I say that is, a lot of times we don't understand that the person that we're talking to who's arguing, and we say, you know, they're intolerant, they're this and that, there's often some hurt there, and when we're shoving truth in their face, even though we think we're doing it in love, we don't understand that we're touching sore spots. So one example, there was a family that I grew up with in Florida, and the mom and dad were getting a divorce at a time where that was really unaccepted in the church, and you know, the children were talked about, and they were talked about, you know, it was a small place, and they were all just it was just horrible for them growing up there. And so the three of them, the three children, the kindest, that like just really good-hearted people, but they have no ability to hear anybody intolerant of homosexuals, of anybody, because they felt condemned growing up. They do not like you to even bring up that someone's behavior is wrong or immoral, or you condemn or judge them in any way. So there's hurt there, and when you're saying something like that, they internalize it. Like it brings back feelings of when they were judged and condemned, and they were the outcasts, and they were, you know. So sometimes you think you're talking about a philosophical, biblical point, or whatever, but you don't know what, like, judged people, you know, don't want to be judged, and they kind of reflect it as like, we're not judging anybody, like, you know, I was condemned by these rules, so there's no rules. Sometimes you just don't know who you're talking to. I'm not saying that applies to everybody. I'm just saying that it sometimes applies. So the way that we deliver the message and who you're talking to, and kind of understanding why they're saying what they're saying, is because there could be some reason that they refuse these things based on certain experiences or sore points that they've had.
Sorry, I guess I'm missing the point. So is it that we shouldn't?
I think so when it comes to social media, I think what should be projected out there is, you can post whatever you want, just as long as it's, I'm not dictating what you guys put on your Instagram, but reflecting your Christian life within. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean putting Bible verses on all of your posts, but at least not showing things that could bring somebody else down, right?
I'm not saying like not Bible verses. I'm just saying sometimes we can put things that that are true and truthful, and I can probably say it, having a conversation with somebody, but when I post it, and it's going to a large group of people who have different pain points, that it could be offensive. I'm not saying don't offend people. Like I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like pick the best venue, and you of course know who is on your social media better than anybody else. But
see, I never post things in a private way. My posts are all public, so whoever sees it sees it. I don't like say, oh, this is for my friends. This is only for family. I just say this is open for public. My life's an open book. Those that see it, see it. If they don't like it, it's on my post. It's on my, you know, whoever wants to follow. But I don't know about, you know, if I'm not posting it directly to someone. I'm just saying that I feel that we're just posting useless information sometimes, where we're not, our goal of living here is to work on our relationship with God. If you have something that maybe I'm struggling with and you don't know it, but if you posted it, it's like the Holy Spirit speaking to me through your action.
But the other half of that is like it leads people to like think wrong about it. Like people like get annoyed. People are like, oh, this person's trying to like be self-righteous or be whatever, and they just want to post it on social media.
Well, then
and like when I see that stuff, like people talk, like, you know what I'm saying? Like they get annoyed. They're like, oh, okay, like you know, you don't come to church.
It depends on the recipient.
I know, but they're like, oh, you come to church at 10 o'clock, but you're posting Bible verses. Does that mean you're better than? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like it leads people to do that. So I'm serious. Like,
fun of me. He goes, wow. You think you're a saint, huh? You sit there and post all these Bible verses. I'm like, I just like them.
See, people do that, and then like people will take it the wrong way, and so like you kind of have to know your audience and know.
I just think when it's a loving Bible verse and all those kind of things that are uplifting and hopeful and stuff, I think those are people can take them however.
People still
I'm just saying sometimes
what's the difference when you said posts things regarding from the diocese point of view or the Orthodox point of view? And it could be very controversial, or any sermon that he posts, and it's posted all over in English throughout. I mean, that's one of the advantages. That's why I feel like, the people that are making a lot of noise and they're getting their points across, but we are like, I want to be careful. I don't want to upset anybody. I'm trying to be too careful where I'm not actually accomplishing anything, and I'll just take care of my life. Yeah. I'll share hey, I ate over here. This is a really good restaurant, and there's nothing wrong with it.
I should have you follow me. I'm not even joking. I'm not even joking. When I have discussions with someone else, they get, and I'm telling you because I see Suzette's point now. Yeah. I've had a discussion with someone where I was like, I have to tell them the truth. Like the truth is, I know what's in the Bible. And the hurt that I saw on their face was so heartbreaking. Like I was like, I did not know I touched on that because
I understand.
you have to have like this really good relationship, and they have to really understand where the point is coming from. Like, is it from your heart, or are you trying to judge me? You know, so.
But it depends on what you're posting. I'm not saying like not putting Bible verse. I'm not saying like that at all. I'm just saying that sometimes when something is controversial, when it's a moral topic like this, and then you just put a post, and the post is true, but I could share it with you, and I can say it to you in a personal way that might not offend you, but when I just slap it in your face and it's a sore point.
But that's what most of it comes across as, like, oh, you posted this picture with your Bible verse in it. Well,
Well,
you
if I
went to
post
church
it
at 10
anyways,
a.m.
if they want to do
That's
that, they
all
can do
I'm
that.
saying
If they
is-
want to read it, they can
But
read
that's
it.
what I'm saying is, when you're having conversations.
Grace, like, please stop posting about
No,
us trying.
I have no problem people posting the things that they're enjoying and so forth. But I feel like that's more of their focus versus that we're here to also witness for God. We're here to work on a relationship with God. For me, I'm missing the point of what's
But
the
it's-
difference
it's-
when a bishop
it's a
does it
social-
versus us doing
It's
it.
a social media. It's a social media. It's
The
not
question-
about a spiritual media.
I
And
don't know.
The question
but
for you though
95% of it is
becomes,
all social activity.
do you care about what people think?
Yeah.
The
That's-
thing,
that's
what
my
I'm
point.
trying
I
to
don't
say
care.
is if we keep throwing this stuff in people's faces, they're not going to be receptive to it. Like Mary was saying, if you're talking to someone, if you're trying to convince them of your point, if you're trying to convince them of anything in Christianity, you have to come across as being loving. I'm just saying, when you post that kind of stuff on social media, it makes a lot of people think, oh, I'm better than you. And I think that
But
you
you
have
I
to care
disagree.
about
have to talk
you
about
have
what
to-
Christmas is
you
really
have to talk about what the
No.
stuff is. I'm not saying
Oh, trust me.
all Christians,
Right.
like you should not have any, no, I'm not saying don't share your faith or witness. I'm just saying when it's a sensitive topic, like sometimes like this, you have to be just
Selective.
mindful of
Selective.
what you're posting, because you could touch on people's sore spot. I'm not saying all Christian posts, nothing like that. I'm just saying sometimes when some things are better said
Mhm.
than
Exactly.
posted.
That's what I'm trying to say too, is it comes across a certain way when it's just thrown on Facebook or thrown on whatever. But if you're trying to convince someone of your point, you're gonna talk to them with love and with like
Right.
conviction.
Yeah.
When you throw it on your Instagram post, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like I'm not saying don't do that ever. At
I mean,
all.
it takes a
But
greater,
when
it
you're-
takes a greater discussion. I mean, something like this on sexuality and morality and sexuality. Believe me, that that post is not going to.
Oh no.
Exactly.
And it's
That's
just
what
gonna
I'm trying to
infuriate
say. Yeah.
people.
No, but
and
if you
I'm
do
gonna
find a
have-
Bible verse that you like,
But a
post
Bible
it.
verse, no, I welcome that.
That's
I mean,
not
that's great.
a
That's an
bad-
but I would
uplifting
say-
message, and
I would
I'm
say
okay with
that,
that.
you know, and I think what Ray's point might have been though is that within the Orthodox Christian community, we don't share things like this more
Mhm.
often. So if I find a good article, yesterday I sent an article to my friend that I used to use this, and she read it, and we both learned from it. But I don't think that happens a lot between
Exactly.
people. We'll send each other pictures of what we had for dinner,
Yeah.
but we don't send each other, you know, important things like this. And that's within the community so that we can all grow and learn and understand our beliefs and truths. I think that's maybe what
Yeah,
you were getting
So
at. As
I'm
opposed
gonna
to,
give you an example. About 3 weeks ago, I had a conversation with Abuna about having Coptic Day, having festivals, fundraising. You know, the situation that we're in this church, and Bishop Yusuf has a very great viewpoint about it. So I talked about, well, we're going to host a carnival, you know, for fundraising, for example. And it sounded like a great idea at the time.
You said that to the Yusuf?
To
Lord.
no, to Father Saint. So, I mean, no, and we all agreed it was a great idea. And people can come and donate, and we need the funds for our church. Very, very transparent, sounds great. He sent me a response from Sayidna, which was an article about views about fundraising, views about carnivals, and it all should be done through donation from the heart. Right? Comparing. You read the article, total convincing. I had a wonderful conversation with Zayden about this before, and very convincing. But just simply sending an article like that to someone, and they read it, they're going to be a little bit taken back
Exactly.
without having the dialogue. So, should we send it out to their entire congregation and for them to read it? You're going to have 10 different viewpoints on that article. Some are going to be very conflicted. Some people are going to like it. Some people are going to really dislike it. And I'm like, I don't think that's a good idea. Does he have a sermon? Do you have a sermon that can actually give you that full impression of what he's trying to convey?
Yeah.
Can he give us something? Well, we don't.
Okay.
But I'm against. So we didn't send it out to the senior congregation, and I agree because it doesn't. Initially, when I first read it, I was a little upset because I was wanting to do fundraising initiative, a carnival, something to bring up our donations for our church. So the message has to be conveyed at the right moment, with the right message behind it, and a simple social message or an email or whatever. I'm very sensitive, trying to be very sensitive now to how it comes across.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know.
I agree with you.
I heard half of that.
Thank you. That was a great lesson, by the way.
I will say that